And I'd like to welcome you first of all. For those of you who do not know anything about BITA, I'd like to start by explaining a bit about the organisation in brief. BITA was set up in 2012, and the purpose of the organisation was to facilitate companies and individuals and people, both in Ireland and the UK, in terms of setting up businesses or interest in other markets, etc. To date, we have 8 chapters in Scotland, Liverpool, Manchester, London, Isle of Man, and of course Ireland. We also are connected to America through INUSA and Australia through Club Hibernia. So BITA's ethos is people who know people that help people. What we do is we aim to create value and opportunity for the ecosystem that is BITA. BITA is currently 450 members. And there is a lot of activity and opportunity within that ecosystem. So one of the areas today is around R&D. And indeed, that is a subject matter that BITA considers of great value. It's one of the examples of when we go into a company, we find out the pathway of where the company is going, how they're operating, and what their ambitions are. And there are certain ways that we can actually create value in that process. So today, I want to concentrate on that R&D area. And we've invited Brendan Morahan to actually join us today from Invennt. These are one of the companies that deal with R&D, but essentially and initially, Brendan also deals specifically in the Irish market. Today, I want to demystify the myths around the R&D tax area, particularly in the Irish market. So this is what this seminar is all about. So welcome, Brendan, and let's start to unfold and demystify this areas. But before we do, could you let us know more about your company?
Certainly, Paul. Well, thanks for giving us the opportunity. And I must say, you're obviously becoming a bit of a dab hand at this now, Paul, aren't you? So late show, watch out. What do we do? Well, we're on a bit of a mission, actually, Paul, to ensure that construction businesses get recognised for the good that they do and then get rewarded accordingly. So why do we do that? Well, it struck me there quite recently that having joined the industry in 1979, I'm now spanning 6 decades in this industry. And I've experienced the industry doing some brilliant things. Not always, but quite often. But it doesn't seem to get recognised for that. And as I say, we're on a mission to change that. I know some great things that are being done, and we've got to make sure that the construction sector is loud and proud and rewarded accordingly.
So let's start at the crux of this. And the whole idea is accessing this value and demystifying the myths around it. And that's what I want to, I'm going to ask you probably certain questions here that will double up on themselves. And what we're looking here is to create the clarity of the actual facts of this, particularly in the Irish market. So in terms of R&D, some people would have never heard of it. Why was the scheme introduced in the first instance?
Sure. And I think it's a really good point, Paul, and please pull me up if I use any acronyms today. I did notice one of the comments on LinkedIn that was asking, what is R&D? And I think that's absolutely valid. It's R&D stands for research and development. And from an Irish perspective, it was introduced in 2004, and it's been introduced for a specific reason. Ireland isn't the only country that does it, but it's been introduced for a specific reason, and that reason is to encourage investment in innovation and research and development. Now, why would any government want to do that? Well, it's sort of obvious, isn't it? But they're looking to improve the productivity in the country, and you improve productivity by getting businesses to do more. But it's also looking for that productivity to be a generator of growth. And again, that growth can't be just in the short term. It's got to be driven through businesses that are truly sustainable, that can keep on reinvesting in themselves to get better and to grow bigger. So the scheme itself is quite generous. You can claim up to 25% of your qualifying cost as a credit against your corporation tax bill. You've got 12 months to complete your claim following the accounting period in which you incur the cost. And it's important to note, Paul, that 25% credit is on top of the 12.5% tax deduction you get on the cost that you've incurred in pursuing R&D type activities. So it's up to 37.5% of your cost is recoverable. Now, one other scheme, I mentioned that it is a credit against your corporation tax bill. If for whatever reason you don't have a tax liability, you can actually claim that back in cash as a refund over a 3-year period.
So the government are paying back this and reducing taxes. Is that not fake news?
It isn't fake news. As I say, it started in 2004 and businesses benefited to the tune of about 70 million euros in that first year. And progressively over the years, the benefits have increased. I think it peaked in 2014, just under 700 million of benefit that businesses accrued as a consequence of these claims. The last figures I looked at, 2017, there are just under 500 million. So it's serious money that is being paid back. And I mentioned earlier that Ireland is actually one of the most generous schemes in the world. But as we're finding, we operate in the UK market as well as Ireland and indeed in Canada. And around the world, there is slow uptake, particularly in the construction sector.
There's a point there now in terms of, so there are, so there's other sectors, first of all, but, you know, one of the areas was that I want to kind of keep going back to the government. First of all, we've now established that it is not fake news. This is a government-backed initiative. So the second thing then I want to, so you mentioned the construction sector in particular. Now we have a very large representation, particularly in the construction sector. So what message do I send out to them in terms of R&D in the construction sector?
Well, I think that's a really important point, Paul. And if I could just finish on the other point, one reinforcing or maybe comfort that people should get is that with COVID-19, the government is actually accelerating the spend. I mentioned earlier that you can get a refund if it's not a credit against your tax over a 3-year period. The government is actually accelerating those payments. So it's another endorsement of how important they see this to be. But going back to your particular point about construction, and it's really important because we hear this all the time, that it doesn't apply to construction. Well, let's go back to the guidelines. The guidelines apply to any company in any industry. So whether it's construction, pharma, finance, whatever, it applies to any company in any industry. What's actually important are the activities that you're undertaking. So what you've got to be doing is seeking advancement in science or technology. If you're taking the risk by innovating, improving or developing a process, a product, a service, then it will likely qualify. So I suppose what we always say to people is, when you started this, did you face any uncertain outcomes at the outset? Did you go beyond applying existing technologies? You know, ask some questions of yourself. Is it actually challenging a need? Is it something that a qualified person with the relevant knowledge wouldn't be able to deal with? So was there a real difficulty? Sometimes you've got to ask yourself, was there any guarantee that it was actually going to solve the problem? Because you can claim even if your attempts failed or you had to abandon them all the way through. And going back to what I've said in my experience in this industry, we overcome unique and diverse challenges every day. So it definitely does apply to construction.
Okay, and another myth is it's too difficult to pull this claim together. So how do we deal with this myth?
Well, look, Paul, running a successful business is difficult, and it's particularly difficult in construction and particularly difficult in this particular period. So in my opinion, that's not a good enough reason not to look into it. But look, the application process is not necessarily that simple to navigate. But, you know, I would say it's worth persevering because the returns are generous. And most importantly, it is important to consider that this is potentially an ongoing benefit, and that can support future innovation and give competitive advantage. And you'd expect me to say that, wouldn't you? But there are people like us who can help.
So what you're saying is Invennt can take my construction members on this journey and walk them through it.
Absolutely. It's what we do. It's why we exist. Going back to what I said at the outset, that is our mission, about recognizing the good that we do and get rewarded for it. And I think that the important point I would say, Paul, is that Yes, it is difficult to start, but it's like anything else that once you understand it and you get the systems and processes in place, it just becomes the way you do things and it gets easier each year.
Okay, now this is the one and the key area that I want answered personally myself, because I've heard this on several times, right? And that is the myth that it opens up inland revenue reviews in Ireland.
Yeah.
True or false?
Well, look, I'd make a couple of points on that, Paul. Every business is always open to review at any time. So the way I would respond to that is that a properly prepared, defendable claim will not alter this. It won't make it better. It won't make it work. But one thing I'd really want to make clear is this isn't a tactic about avoiding paying tax. You know, we do need to be crystal clear. This is an expensive scheme for the country. I mentioned the figures there earlier. And it's using public money to promote business improvement for the long-term good of the country as a whole. The revenue, obviously, and we'd expect them to, wouldn't we? They're going to scrutinise the claims to ensure they comply with all the relevant legislation. And they do this from both a technical and a financial perspective. So there are two tests. There's a science test that ensures that the activities meet the statutory definition of R&D activity. And there's the accounting test, which ensures that the costs incurred have been properly tracked and accounted for. So it's really important that the claim is compliant, credible, explainable, and ultimately defendable.
But what you're saying so is no, it will not open up reviews if it's done in the right way.
Well, I'm saying it's neither going to open up the reviews or prevent the reviews. It's independent. Every business has got to run its own business in the right way. The R&D tax claim has got to be compliant and credible and defendable. And it'll be subject to scrutiny, of course, but if you're running your business in the way that most businesses run themselves, it neither helps nor hinders as far as an overall review is concerned.
Okay. And even if you claim, is it worth it?
I think that's a good point. And I suppose it comes back a little bit to your definition of worth. I mean, as I hope I've indicated, it can have a very positive and significant impact on your company finances to enable you to invest in future sustainability of the business. But I think thinking of this in the bigger sense, and maybe I'd share an example of a client, an Irish client that we had recently during one of our workshops with about 15 people of his business. He actually stopped the meeting and it was like a flash of inspiration. He said, look, guys, I've just seen this. This is going to transform how we will run our business. We are going to become a more innovative business. So there is a strategic driver. He could see the competitive advantage of being more innovative than those he competes with. But I would go on to say it's also from a marketing PR perspective. Which clients of yours would not want to be working with a progressive company, want companies that are coming in with ideas and innovations to actually improve the services provided? And the final point I would say is we're in an industry that is always up against it in retaining and attracting great staff. And again, if you want great staff, they want to be working in an exciting, vibrant place where they can bring their ideas and know that those ideas are going to be nurtured and carried through. So I think there are a number of different reasons why, in my opinion, it is worth it, and it goes beyond financial. And I always say that I would encourage people to think of this strategically. Think about the long-term future of your business, rather than just looking backwards at what I can recover for the last 12 months, or even just looking at this in the short term of the next year or two.
Okay, and another myth then is it goes into the area of a company's growth, for instance. So a myth is that we don't have good enough records, so can we apply? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, I think this is a very important issue for us. I mean, it is a requirement that businesses have to maintain contemporaneous, as they call it, contemporaneous and relevant records of the expenditure incurred. And I know that in this industry and indeed many other industries, that isn't always the case at the time. And to a certain extent, it is recognized that some companies don't have those perfect records. And that isn't ideal to make a claim, but nor does it make it impossible. And again, we work with our clients, particularly in that first year, to concentrate not just about receiving the tax credit for the works that have undertaken, although that is important in itself, but as importantly, or maybe more importantly, it's about implementing a process that enables the credit to be fully utilised in the future.
Okay, another nice one here now, and this is coming from, I suppose, the sentiment of loyalty. You know, am I standing on my accountant's toes if I go to you and apply for R&D tax credits?
Well, it's an interesting point, and one of the barriers, or one of the conversations we often have when we open up these discussions with organisations is just that. They say that, well, if this is so good, why hasn't my FD mentioned it, or why hasn't my accountant mentioned it? And so I think that is a common, you used the term in the title about myths. I wouldn't call it a myth, but it's certainly part of the problem. But I think that's an understandable issue by FDs and accountants for a couple of reasons. They may feel uncomfortable that they haven't raised this previously and are concerned that the benefits that they haven't been enjoyed sooner. But in our opinion, they shouldn't, because as I mentioned earlier, there has been a slow take-up, and particularly in this sector, the take-up has generally been quite poor. So, you know, we're all in this together. The other point I would say, and from personal experience, that generally they are financial experts, not necessarily construction experts. So they themselves may not recognise some of the activity as qualifying. But as importantly, and it goes back to one of the concerns I have with us as an industry, is we're quite a humble industry. We like challenges and we just seek them. We don't necessarily talk about what we do. And therefore, I've experienced it both personally and now with the work that we do, that there are great things being done in businesses, but they don't really get spoken about within the businesses, and they certainly don't necessarily get back into the boardroom. So accountants and FDs don't necessarily hear all of the good work that is being done that potentially qualifies.
Okay, another myth is, you know, how can we apply? We're too busy anyway, and we don't have the technical expertise to identify whether it's R&D or not. Take us through that.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, and clearly, again, I would say it, wouldn't I? Well, then work with people like us. Our approach, as I indicated there with the accountant and FDs, it's not about pointing figures. It's about working with them as part of the team to make that initial assessment, to make sure that there is something to go out there, and then collectively prepare a defendable claim and improve those systems and processes for the future that I mentioned earlier. I think the expertise that we bring in is that we can identify what is routine problem solving, but also to recognise that what meets the definition for tax purposes in construction is not necessarily obvious. And as part of our service, that whilst it's not a legal obligation, we prepare a report to accompany the claim. And this justifies the technical advancements and uncertainties that have been uncovered. And we also detail the eligible expenditure that is being claimed on a project-by-project basis. And as I've mentioned a couple of times before, we then work with those organisations about the future to help identify eligible activities from the start of a project and implement robust and efficient systems to ensure the R&D process is evidenced on a timely and consistent basis. So that ticks the contemporaneous records box. So what would I always say to people is, compare the short-term benefit of your current busyness with the long-term strategic advantage of being an innovative-based business that is rewarded accordingly.
Okay, I want to take one of the questions now, a couple of questions from the people on watching this webinar. And one is going back to the last point you made in terms of how does the construction companies satisfy the field of science and technology technology test for relief?
Well, I think one of the sayings we always discuss with our clients is, think about, are you trying to do something safer, quicker, greener? And invariably you are. And therefore that should be the starting point for consideration of a claim. You know, I mentioned earlier about innovation starts with either a need or a problem. And there's a lot of creativity that goes into overcoming those. And we are an industry that, because of the diverse and unique nature of it, is constantly facing problems and therefore constantly having to come up with solutions. Now, some of those solutions exist already, but many don't. Or some of those solutions don't apply in this particular instance and they need to be adapted to suit. So I think we always encourage clients to almost look backwards and say, is there a difficulty? Is there a need? Well, that's potentially the start of an R&D or an innovation claim.
Okay, so to continue on the theme of, because I wrote down a few, myths that I want to get through. So in terms of the next one is, we're great at problem solving, but this is not R&D, is it?
Well, the answer is not necessarily, I suppose, but it might be. Keep asking yourself, has this problem been solved before? Because if it hasn't, it may qualify. There's no guarantees, but it may qualify. One of the things we always suggest to people is deploy the Google test. Bluntly, if you can Google the answer, then it probably, well, it isn't R&D. But if you can't, then it may qualify. And I go back to what I was saying about that. Think about the problem, think about how you're solving it, and most innovations usually start there. And sometimes the innovations aren't the obvious ones. I mean, we're going through a crisis at the moment, and a lot of people are coming up with means to overcome that crisis. Now, that might be just down to PPE, it might be down to the tools that you're using to reduce the amount of people that are involved. There are all sorts of problems that we're currently facing that people are overcoming day by day. And I think this, going back to what I said earlier about the great people in this industry, we love problems. And when we have problems, we use the experience and the technical expertise to come up with creative solutions to those. And that's potentially the starting point for innovation and therefore an R&D claim.
Okay, and just to take you to the final few myths, it only applies to scientists and inventors, doesn't it? No?
Well, don't forget that there are some scientists and inventors in the construction sector as well. But the important point, Paul, seriously, is that scheme doesn't apply to certain designations or titles. It applies to the activities. And look, going back to what I've said earlier, I'm really proud to be associated with the industry. And some of the most impressive people, in my opinion, in the country operate in the construction sector. They're involved day in, day out in deploying their technical and their practical experience, in developing technological advancements all the time, in producing new or improving existing materials, products, services, devices, processes, you name it, they're doing it. And in so doing, many are undertaking R&D that could qualify for an R&D tax credit. But maybe going back to that humility point that I mentioned earlier, we often do it without necessarily being aware of it. And if we're aware of it, we don't necessarily talk about it. And even if we talk about it, we don't necessarily get rewarded for doing so. And in my opinion, we need to change that, get rewarded for it, and start reinvesting in doing more of it.
Okay, I have a question here from Muriel Cuddy from a health company in Clonmel, which we spoke to yesterday. Will someone walk any business through this process?
Absolutely. We would welcome people just giving us a call. We would normally meet up face to face, but in the short term, we've no more than yourself, Paul. We've got quite adept at using Teams or Zoom or whatever medium is appropriate for people, and we can talk it through. We've got presentations that can both explain the scheme in more detail from a government perspective. We can walk people through the sorts of processes that we follow. We can have initial discussion with them about the sort of activities that they do, just to see if they qualify. And if they do, we can then help them through that process. If they don't, we can guide them as to what maybe they do need to do so that we can have a conversation in the future when they think that it does apply to them. But I would almost challenge anyone that's listening to this to question themselves as to whether they don't have anything. I'd be surprised if they don't. It doesn't necessarily mean it justifies them putting forward a claim, but it might justify them starting to think about how do they have a more meaningful claim in the future. But no, in answer to Muriel's question, would be delighted to take a call and arrange a meeting virtually in the short term and in person thereafter.
Brilliant. In terms of the difference between a loss-making company and a profit-making company, where does it lie there?
With the profit-making company, the credit is offset against your corporation tax liability moving forward. If you're a loss-making company, you obviously don't have a corporation tax liability, and therefore you can take the credit in terms of cash. Now that cash, I touched on this earlier, is as far as the scheme is concerned, it's recoverable over a 3-year period. But as I mentioned, because of the current situation with COVID, if there are organisations in that particular situation, the government are actually accelerating the payment of that cash.
And finally, could you differentiate in terms of the scheme? I know it's in existence in Ireland and the UK. How does it differ in terms of percentage and in terms of time frame?
In the UK, you can go back 2 years. In Ireland, you can only go back 1 year. In the UK, the scheme differentiates between the size of the business, whereas in Ireland, there is a scheme that covers everyone. I should just add that for micro businesses, those with turnover of less than 10 million euros or less than 50 people, the tax credit was recently increased to 30%. So there's a difference in that scheme, in that sense. So the recovery is more generous in Ireland than in the UK. The record keeping is somewhat more onerous in Ireland than it is in the UK. But from our perspective, the reports that we produce follow the same rigor in both, well, in all 3 jurisdictions. We do this in Canada as well. So the scheme is broadly similar. The timescales are different, and the results, the percentages are different. But as I say, fortunately for the Irish market, it is somewhat more generous.
Brilliant. Okay, well, listen, Brendan, thank you very much for demystifying, as you have done, in a very clear way, the whole area of R&D tax credits in the construction industry, in Ireland in particular. I'd like to thank you for the information. Those of you who would like to access this will be online in recording format on BITA just shortly after this live podcast. So thank you very much for joining us, and good morning to everybody, and we hope to see you soon again on the online platform. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers, Paul.